He's got to send it out to Mast, and he's got to do something quick. The crowd counting it off. Mast puts it up. It's going to be Max Sheppard back there against everybody, and he comes down with it! And he comes down with it! John Mast knew who he had back there, and with nothing left on the clock, Max Sheppard gets to line up his jump. It was perfectly placed, and the Thunderbirds win the game 18-17. How do you like that?
What an incredible... What's up, everybody? Welcome to Swing Pass. I'm Evan Lepler alongside Adam Ruffner. Delighted to be back on the pod for my second episode. Adam has not fired me yet. And we've got a ton of UFA news to discuss. Our broadcast colleague Ian Toner has reported a bunch of fascinating free agent movement in the past 48 hours. Max Sheppard and Calvin Brown to New York. Tobe Decraene to Boston. Sean Connole, handler for Salt Lake, going to Atlanta. The hot stove keeps on churning. Adam, what's the biggest headline of the week in your mind?
I mean, there's been these seismic shifts, it feels like, every single week with all this roster announcement. It's hard to really get a sense of what the landscape is, but I feel like this week it's got to be the Decraene news. I mean, this is the reigning unanimous Rookie of the Year. He was one of the leading scorers in the league last year. I believe he finished 6th in total scores. He was in the top 7 in blocks. This is one of the most electrifying playmakers in the entire association right now. And he goes from Montreal, who is just starting to look feisty at the end of last year, to this Boston team that knocked off New York in the first round of the playoffs, gave DC a good challenge in the East Division Championship game, and now slots in one of the best playmakers alongside the two-time reigning MVP, Jeff Babbitt, as well as a slew of returners from last year. The Glory just look loaded right now. We've been focusing on all these other kind of divisions, and all of a sudden this week it's just beasts in the East. And then you go from there, you got to talk about Sheppard and Calvin Brown joining New York. New York has added now, I think, 5 interesting free agent pieces with Sheppard, Brown, as well as Evers Shapiro, Dmitry Suvorov, and Oliver Fay. There's a lot of size, and I feel like interesting role player pieces. New York does such a great job of integrating new players. They're going to have pretty manicured roles and positions for these new guys. I'm interested to see how that goes there. I feel like the Empire, despite that loss in the first round to Boston, was one of the better teams in the league last year. They got those huge wins over Minnesota and Salt Lake. I mean, and this isn't even talking about Atlanta, who just plugged the hole from the Bobby Lay retirement with Sean Connole, who leads Salt Lake as the franchise leader in yardage and its hucking leader as well. This is one of the best deep passers in the entire league. It's again, these are news items we would spend usually like 2 weeks marinating on, kind of sifting through, and it's just going to be on to the next. I mean, again, we're sitting on a slew of other news from, again, another East Division playoff team, as well as teams out west. We've got tons of other news to cover as well from Colorado and Carolina today. It's a smorgasbord, man. But, getting back to the focus, I think it's got to be Decraene. Like, he's just different, man. Like, you could see it in his pro debut last year at Boston and at New York. I mean, he lit it up on the field, and now he's going to be surrounded by even more talent. He's one of the most motivated weight room training athletes in the sport right now. Like, I'm just excited to see where his ceiling is at. And you being a Boston homer, I've got to know your kind of both personal and professional takes here. What do you think about this Glory team and, their chances of making their first championship weekend, maybe surpassing DC in the East? Can they fend off New York? What are the New York additions? What are your takes here?
So, a couple things. First of all, I am a Boston homer, but I am not a Boston Glory homer. And I don't think I've ever been accused of being a Boston Glory homer. I grew up in Massachusetts. I grew up watching the Celtics, the Red Sox, the Patriots, the Bruins, Boston College, UMass, led by John Calipari. Yes, I still am a kid at heart, a masshole at heart.
Every Boston affiliated sports team. You were going to start going into like Holy Cross and stuff there.
I could keep going, man. I was just scratching the surface.
You're like, but not the Glory. Not in that house.
We own Nancy Kerrigan, my friend. We are Boston strong. But to your point, I think there are a few interesting things at play here, big picture. Like, first of all, caveat, every situation is different. Like why a player might move from one team to another. There are competitive concerns, there are life concerns, there like each situation is unique, but generally we are seeing more player movement with top players from around the league that have maybe struggled to break through. Max Sheppard, Tobe Decraene, like statistically, two of the best in the league that we've seen ever. Toba's never been in a playoff game. Max hadn't been in a playoff game since he was a little kid. It's been a while for the Pittsburgh Thunderbirds. Now we see these guys wanting to join good teams. Again, there's a lot of circumstances that go into each of these things, so that's an overly simplistic way of looking at it. But generally, we see the same thing with Cam Brock and Alec Wilson-Holiday and like guys around the league for lifestyle and competitive reasons. And I do think that organizations' willingness to spend some money to bring a guy in, to pay a guy's travel costs, to encourage someone to move, to help them get set up in a new home, getting them an internship, getting them a part-time job outside of Ultimate, because Ultimate generally cannot pay all the bills for most people at this time. Like, I do think franchises and organizations deserve credit. And look, we're seeing teams that want to win and are not just bringing back the same group. Like we saw New York lose a couple guys last year late in the process. That caught them off guard. They expected in January of last year Ryan Osgar to be on the team. They expected in February last year that Jeff Babbitt would be on the team. Those are two MVPs that they lost. They were still really good. They still throttled Minnesota and Salt Lake, but they weren't good enough to get out of the East. So we see New York making moves, bringing in accomplished, experienced players. Like I talked to Matt Stevens a few weeks ago, and one thing he said Dmitry Suvorov, who is a guy that maybe not a lot of people know, played for Philly, has been kind of a sixth cutter on the O-line, a filler type guy. Matt Stevens said, Dmitry Suvorov is a guy that's on a championship team, just like a fill-in. He's probably not going to be on the O-line in the championship game, but when they're missing a guy or two on the O-line in June or July, they could slot Dima Suvorov in there and expect consistency, productivity, and not mistakes. So that's the type of thing that we're seeing teams add on. Now, the stars coming in, like what is it going to look like with Tobe Decraene and Jeff Babbitt on the field at the same time, especially if it's with Tanner Johnson go. Well, like, could you imagine a line?
That I start to have with so much of the star movement is just where are all these pieces going to fit? Again, we kind of talked about it a little bit last week with Chicago, but like with Boston too, like are Decraene and Babbitt going to play on offense together? Ostensibly, yes, I think, given their respective talents. But, Jeff Babbitt made his hay coming into this league as one of the best defenders, was basically a defensive coordinator for, the first two, I think, New York Empire championship game appearances. Like, he could go back to defense. Like, I'm kind of interested to see, like, do we see the stars sort of forming up like Voltron and forming like this super weapon, or do you see them dispersing more between lines and having a little bit more, I think, adaptability in how you call certain rotations? Because again, what we saw most effective last year was what Minnesota did, which was two-way playing Brian Vanuka, which was figuring out places to spot start Matt Rader and get the most out of him. Like, I think that there's going to be a challenge this year for most coaching staffs, particularly on these top teams, to really figure out where is the biggest gain for these players and not just allow Decraene to go for, the stat numbers, the good looking, end of season sort of resume.
Adam, we started to see that last year around the league with coaches getting a little bit smarter and more innovative with how they, like, I think the Salt Lake Shred had like 4 or 5 D lines, and like, Grant Lindsley was on one, Will Selfridge was on one, and maybe Sean Connole was on one. And like, those are all,
when he was working back from injury.
Yeah. So those are all O-line guys. Like the Boston Glory, if they're at full strength, could have, always have one of Babbitt, Decraene, Tanner Johnson go, Orion Cable on the field. More often than not, they could have two of them on the field. And at times, they could have all four of them on the field with Ben
You're
Sadok,
skipping over
Simon
one of my
Carapella.
favorites, Peter Borth. Like, he was
And
one
Peter
of those
Borth.
players who really came out last year. I thought he was super instrumental in playing Jack Williams in that first round playoff matchup. You know, obviously you can't just shut down Jack in the postseason, but I thought Borth got terrific opportunities in transition and just made things harder for New York's point of attack, right?
Yeah, 2 points to make on that. Sam Rosenthal said late in the year that when they were missing O-line cutters and they had to move Peter Borth over from O to D, or from D to O, excuse me, their D-line took a serious hit, both in their ability to stop other teams' top players and their ability to convert after a turn. Getting Borth on Jack Williams on the Boston D-line in the playoffs was huge for them. That's the first point. The second point that I want to make that I think is really important, particularly thinking about Decraene and Babbitt. You know, Tobe had 18 blocks last year in 11 games, played about 2/3 of his season on offense, played 91 D points, which is not a small number as well for a team that, got broken a bunch like the Royale did. To have guys that are block hunters on the O-line is like the biggest luxury in professional ultimate. Because, look, as long as you hold, doesn't really matter how you do it. Like, yes, you'd like to have clean holds, but as long as you don't get broken, and if you got top-notch defenders on the field, in like Jeff in Toba, after a turn, you're in really good shape. So I think, like, it's going to be fascinating to watch Decraene try and fit in with a team that has a little bit more talent. But we've seen him play with great European teams. And the unbelievable thing about this kid, and it's fair to call him a kid, he's 21 years old. He'll be 21. He was 20 last year. Like,
I know.
This is
it's just beginning. I mean, him and Tobias Brooks, right? Like, it is getting scary how fast those two are developing. And I really feel like 2025 might be the year we see them kind of competing for possibly the 3-letter award at the end of the season, right? Like, I mean, they're really that kind of impactful players. They're going to be on these teams in the thick of their divisional playoff races. And with that, I've got a question for you. Today, what is your positioning in the East Division end of regular season?
Can I answer that question in like 20 minutes when we've broken down New York and thought through together what their lineups are going to be?
Fine.
I'll get there. Let's get there. Let's get there by the end of the pod. The name that popped into my mind as I was just thinking about Tobe Decraene and how young he is and how skilled he is and how competitive he is. The guy that's going to be the number one pick in the NBA draft. And it doesn't give me a ton of pleasure to mention a Duke Blue Devil, but Cooper Flagg's a New England kid. He's from Maine.
Shout out Cameron Brock.
He's basically he's an honorary
him.
masshole in my book. And Cooper Flagg is unreal. And like, I don't know if you've watched a lot of Duke men's basketball this year. They just thrashed my Wake Forest Demon Deacons on Big Monday.
I haven't, but I've watched Tobe Decraene a whole bunch. Do you want to talk about him?
Well, I'm just saying the things that Cooper Flagg does from a skilled competitiveness. He's just beyond his years, and Cooper's 18. But like for Tobe to do the things he did at 20 last year, and now ascending to a better team with more talent around him. Really, the sky's the limit. And could he challenge for MVP this year? Abso-freaking-lutely.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the questions that I have that's like biggest approaching in this season is, you know, it's kind of easy to do the 3-9 to 9-3 turnaround for teams like Seattle did last year. You know, you kind of really pull it together. You kind of come out of this cellar dweller position and you rally up the standings, right? What's a lot harder is going from 8 or 9 wins to 10, or getting that first seed in your division and a first round bye, right? Like
the next step in the playoffs.
That incremental shift up from already being a contender. I mean, look at like Atlanta, you know, sorry to pick on them, but they've kind of been throttled in this position of, hey, they're clearly a top 5 team. How do they get to the next step? Chicago, similarly in the past, you know, they clearly have the talent of a championship roster. what is that next gear? And that's what's starting to become my question for these teams, right? Like Boston has clear championship talent, no doubt about it. But what's it going to take for them to get past DC or fend off? And let's talk about them. New York, let's talk about what Sheppard and Calvin Brown add to this team, right? We're a little less familiar with what Brown's availability will be heading into 2025, but there's no doubt about him being a top 5 pure thrower in the sport when he's feeling it. Talk about infinite range from either side and kind of being able to shift the landscape of a given game with an individual throw. That is Calvin Brown. Then you have Max Sheppard, who we've kind of touched on a bit, but let's dig into it, right? He's one of the best scorers in this league's history. He's been the MVP of the initial All-Star game in 2019 and was a finalist for it in the second follow-up in 2022, when he is surrounded by the kind of players that, like the Empire roster, he seems to elevate to an even higher level. With those Pittsburgh Thunderbird teams that he played on at the beginning of his career, they were making divisional title runs, and he was, a pretty good playmaker playing in that 5, 6, 7 cutter role as a very young Thunderbirds prospect. It feels like he gets to reprise that a little bit on this Empire team. Their offense has its foundation, right? And so I want to see if Sheppard can finally make that maturation evolution of, he's going to be one of the fastest guys on the field. He can get to his spots. Can he do it within the system and not over stress or speed up in the ways that we've seen him do with the Thunderbirds? Because quite frankly, last year, Pittsburgh played better without him. They couldn't figure out where to really place him. He tried to platoon a bit on defense, and by the end of the season, they had kind of phased him out a bit. Very strange, but that's what had happened and kind of, facilitated this movement onward, I think. But how does one of the most clearly talented players in this league find his footing on a team that's going to ask him to play a role? That's not something he's done for 8 years, kind of after the Thunderbirds made their 3 straight Central Division championship games, a bunch of guys moved on and Sheppard got full reins and could score 90 times in a season, but it was perpetual green light, right? That's not going to be New York. So what do you think the ideal situation is for Sheppard in New York? Because I think we see it. It's just realizing it, right?
Yeah, what do I think and what do Matt Stevens and Anthony Nunez think is also could be a very different question. And I'm not saying I'm right.
Well, they're over the moon about him, and they should be. This has been a target that they've been after for a few off seasons, and it's finally fallen through. And to your point about losing Osgar and Babbitt before last year, you look at arms that can replicate an Osgar cross-field OI throw. Sheppard's got that in the bag, man. They've needed that extra dimension on their deep throws. Sheppard is a perfect piece fit for that. Can it develop?
So a few thoughts on that. This has been brewing for a while for Max Sheppard. He has been looking elsewhere for a while.
Oh, yeah.
That perhaps is, either a symptom or an explanation for the things you mentioned in Pittsburgh about how they were at times a crisper team without him, a more composed unit without him. How will he fit into New York? How do I think he could best fit into New York? I think, look, he's still in his 20s. He'll be 30 this summer. He's still a guy that relies on his speed and athleticism. And I think he's the type of guy that, as long as he stays relatively healthy, can age pretty well into his 30s as an athlete. So how do I think? I envision a New York D-line with Calvin Brown, John Randolph, and Max Sheppard.
Yeah.
And let those 3 guys make plays, make life difficult for opposing cutters and handlers, and use their tremendous skill after a turn. Now, with that said, from what I understand, the Empire are planning, at least initially, to have Max Sheppard on the O-line. And that was the plan with
Yeah,
Liam Haberfield.
you've got to roll that set of dice, right?
Hang on, Adam, hang on one second. That was the plan with Liam Haberfield last year, and we know how that worked out. Now, here are the numbers that you need to know.
I'll just say again, that wasn't Liam's fault. Hold on, let's pause there for just a second because we just described how their offensive starters came apart weeks before the season, and he's got to jump in and be the Band-Aid on top of this falling apart situation, a changing of the guard for the league's winningest team. I do empathize with him, being thrust into, hey, we need an Oscar fill. How about this new guy from Atlanta who played really well? Sure. I think Shep will have slightly easier circumstances than that, surely.
Well, maybe. He's certainly more experienced in the UFA game. Let me get to the point I was going to make, though. Fine. Listen to these numbers. 94.4, 95.3, 94.8, 96.4, 97.2, 95 point, basically 95, 96%. The completion percentages for the top 9 Empire O-line guys last year. Mm-hmm. Max Sheppard has a career completion rate. Do you know what it is? You want to guess what it is?
Is it above 90?
No, it is not.
Yeah.
It is not above 89.
Yeah.
It is 88.3. Last year in 8 games for the Thunderbirds, his completion rate was 84.9.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that Max Sheppard is turnover prone. That's not what I'm trying to say. But there's a difference, as you know, of valuing the disc in the East Division in those New York, D.C., New York, Boston, D.C., Boston games than it is
25 total turnovers.
The windy cluster at Highmark Stadium or in Indy or in it's just a different game. And disc possession is at the premium, especially for O-lines, which is why my mind goes to let Max cook on D, because it's just a completely different mindset. And that's hard for players to do, to embrace. You can say, yeah, I'm ready to embrace that mindset, but you need to play fast to be on a New York or DC or Boston O-line. And if you're hesitating and you don't know what's the right shot and you don't have full understanding of what your teammates can do and what the other defenders in the division can do and time and score and all those types of things. And look, this is going to come off as kind of a jerk. When was the last time Max Sheppard played in a really big game?
2019 playoffs. Well, I'll say also the final regular season game in 2021 against Atlanta. Pittsburgh made a pretty good run at it. I was actually just going through it, looking at highlights the other day, and Max had a big game there. But again, to your point, Pittsburgh wasn't in a position to play for a playoff game. They were just playing well against a good team late in the season. So
I mean, he completed 8 hucks that game. He had, almost 800 total yards, 8 assists, 5 goals. Most important thing that jumps out at me, he had 4 throwaways in that game. And they lost 26-25 in OT. In a game which I think made them 1-11 on the season. The best one-win team in history, as they like to claim to be. So,
I don't want to challenge what you were saying, because I do generally agree with your thesis around just the mistake-free level of ultimate that has to be played at the top end of the East Division. It's even my question about Toronto this season is just, clearly they're adding talent, but can they bring down those mistake numbers to within a realm of competitiveness? Because again, DC, Boston, and New York, I think I'd have to go double check, but those are the top 3 teams in fewest turnovers per game. You have to play this vice grip possession game if you're going to win in that division. And so I totally hear you out there. My question, though, and my challenge to it is, given New York's struggles to stretch the field offensively last year, it felt like towards the end of the season, you could settle in a bit and predictably get more aggressive on underneath cuts against the Empire offense, because they just were not going to test you deep often. So you could kind of play a little bit underneath. And I think you saw that in the playoff game against Boston, where sure, Boston wasn't getting all of the layout blocks, but they were pressuring a lot of the Empire looks and just kind of congesting the midfield in a way where it was, tooth and nail to kind of move the chains against the Glory defense. And I just wonder if the simple threat of having Sheppard on a rail with his capabilities as a thrower is enough to loosen things up more for this New York team that, again, wasn't just missing Babbitt and Osgar. John Lithgow, too, man. I mean, one of the best continuation throwers. Sounds like he'll also be missing the 2025 season for Chicago. He was fantastic for them last year. He's one of the question pieces that I have just about the Union in general. He's been one of the most reliable continuation cutters in the league since he joined in 2021 with New York. So, there's these dimensions that were absent from the New York attack last year that were so central to how they won their championships. And I just wonder if Sheppard's particular skill set re-enables them to play some of that, as Jack Williams and Benyat and that Empire core continue to extend their playing primes, right? I don't know that you can just rely on Benyat to have the game that he had in the 2023 East Division Championship game anymore, where he goes off for, 800 damn receiving yards and 7 scores. I don't know that he can take over in those ways anymore. He didn't have a turnover the last 6 games last year. He's one of the most efficient players in the league now. And just again, can New York kind of continue their identity while adding in these new pieces? Because I do think their ability to threaten you deep was one of the ways in which they hurt teams the most, even just on approach offensively, and they did not have that at all last year. They just could not attack deep. I mean, that game against Atlanta that broke the streak, they couldn't do anything with the Huck game against that hustle defense. And I just feel like Sheppard gives them that again. It just, they can go long.
I think all these new pieces will help evolve their identity, which is a totally healthy thing. I think your point about having someone to stretch the field with the arm, with their throws, is a really good one. Last year, Elliot Chartok led the team with 15 Huck completions for the year. 2 years ago, 2023, Ryan Osgar had 35 Huck completions. But I also think, just like Liam Haberfield can't be kind of put into, he'll take that Osgar role. Max Sheppard's a really good player, but he's not Ryan Osgar. And that's just how special Osgar was in 22 and 23.
There's Quinn Finer and Ryan Osgar as deep throwers in terms of efficiency and raw production totals. And then there is a gap, man. Those two are just on a different plane with their continuation throws.
Yeah. You forget,
right, what's the East Division playoff seeding? Come on.
The East Division. Well, we don't know what DC's roster looks like right now. No. So what should we assume about DC?
Let's say, without giving too much away, they re-add one of their central stars from the past couple of seasons, and they have the same roster from last year, albeit a couple of losses. Malks, I don't think is set to return to the team. So take that into account. But let's say
they're bringing back Xavier Maxstad. That's what you're saying. Maxstad, center handler, and going into the time machine. No, I think it's reasonable to expect DC to be really good too. So I think we have very clearly 4 teams for 3 playoff spots, and right now, I lean New York as number 1. And that is buying into what they have built over the past half decade and the expectations and the confidence that so many guys on that team have when they take the field. It is a belief in Oliver Chartok continuing to develop. It is a belief that John Randolph can even take another step forward. I also, like what we saw from a lot of their young guys. And I know Matt Stevens is high and a couple other U24, U20 U.S. national team guys that aren't household names yet, but could be difference makers. So I think if Calvin Brown plays regularly and if Max Sheppard can fill a role and be the best of Max Sheppard and not the worst of Max Sheppard, if that's like a fair thing to say. And look, another point Matt Stevens made was the best he's ever played was when he's been surrounded by great talent. Now that's an all-star game.
In an exhibition game.
Yeah,
they were wearing like pants, we couldn't even
No.
get them to get into full game shorts. So
2019 All-Star game was super competitive.
it was very competitive in the second half. I don't see anyone pulling out Kobe's All-Star game numbers to describe resumes. Like some of that stat, especially in those environments, are a little, take it with a grain of salt. Like I'm not here to disparage how he played in those games. I mean, he was phenomenal. It's just
when I think about Jason Tatum, Adam, first and foremost, I think of his All-Star game record, 53 points. That's his number one achievement in basketball.
Yep, absolutely.
So
the other thing I want to add about New York, because I don't disagree with you as a number one pick, their size. This is going to be a big team. I mean, they had Shapiro, Faye, Calvin Brown's got some size to him. They already have Yacht, Oliver Chartok. I think that they're going to be pretty imposing just to match up with in the East Division. I mean, Boston, too. There's just going to be a lot to deal with in the air from those two teams.
The other information that's going to drop this week, I would think, if not this week, then next week, will someone like Marquez Brownlee make the U.S. World Games team? And how would that trickle down and impact the New York Empire? Like, for his sake, making the World Games team is an honor of a lifetime. That it'd be cool if he gets that opportunity. I don't know if it's the best thing for the Empire, though. Like, he's gone to all these tryouts. He's been around all these great players. Sure, iron sharpens iron, and players get better from those experiences. But that may be the difference. I mean, Marquez has played almost every game since he joined the team. He could play 7 games instead of 12 if he makes the World Games team. That's just a reality of the situation. It could put his, if New York is playing Boston in the divisional championship game on August 9th, like that's 3 days before the World Games competition starts in Chengdu, China. That puts his, so we don't know what we don't know.
I mean, you want to start talking about August right now? We didn't even have half this information 5 days ago. Like
you asked me for a hierarchy.
Yeah,
you asked me for a hierarchy, and I'm thinking about the hierarchy at the end of the season. So I lean towards New York 1, Boston 2, DC 3, Toronto 3.5.
I mean, Toronto, I think as the season approaches, is the true dark horse team, right? We're not going to be familiar with what the rotations are. They're going to be kind of cycling in at different international players at different times, as far as I understand it. They're bringing back all these returners who have had great individual seasons with the Rush, but they've kind of never been all at the same time. And yet they've got size, they've got speed, they've got a bunch of talent. There's a lot of World Games Canada experience suddenly on the Rush.
Well, Canada's also going to be impacted by that with multiple guys on their team on the Canadian World Games squad, and that's going to impact their consistency and availability throughout the season. So that is certainly a factor in my thinking about that for the Toronto Rush.
I'll do mine quickly. Boston, DC, New York. I don't know why I keep putting New York third, because I generally, when I just do a flash take, I think I agree with you. Right now, I'd almost put them 1, given the quality of their wins last year, given just, I think their 5 total losses came in very understandable ways, as opposed to a lot of other teams' losses last year. So I think that they can correct where they went wrong, but I don't know, just something about Boston's momentum. Again, they added Jeff Babbitt on April 1st last year. They have a whole offseason to him, as well as adding last year's Rookie of the Year, one of the best 14 players in the league. I don't know. I like where Boston's heading. They've got some, I think, institutional gap between DC and New York, but they might be able to kind of overcome that. I think we should move on.
Let me say one more thing about that, and then we'll move on.
Fine. It's Boston, so I'll tolerate it because you get a little bit more leeway that way.
I do think, like I said, I had Boston 2. I'm surprised you have them 1, but I get it. Let me just say this as I preface my statement like a politician. I think it is more likely that Boston misses the playoffs in favor of Toronto than DC.
I
I,
don't think
I
so because of schedules. I'll contest you there, and that's half of why I have Boston in the pole position. I just think DC and New York have more opportunities to slip up against good opponents, and Boston has a pretty favorable slate, all things considered, in 2025.
They've DC 3 times, and that's, if I think 2 of them are in DC. So
Yeah,
if DC could win their home games against Boston, they'll be in a decent spot. Yes, DC has to go to Carolina. Boston doesn't have an interdivisional game, maybe an extra one against Montreal mixed in there. So yeah, I hear that. I trust DC's stability
sure.
from what we've
I
seen
can't
over the
disagree
past
with you
half
there.
decade and see Boston still as a roller coaster. Like they could have good games, but they could also be sloppy. And yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating to watch. And as I said, I told you what my hierarchy was. But if Toronto is going to supplant one of those teams, I think Boston is the most likely of last year's top 3 to be on the outside looking in.
You can bet against Jeff Babbitt, man. I think that man has won at least one playoff game every single year since 2018. So,
Well,
that's your thing to work out between him and the maker, but
I
let's continue to
expect you
move
to
on.
never call me a Boston homer again after that take.
So we touched on briefly Atlanta. They had Sean Connole, Salt Lake's current yardage and Huck completions leader, one of the best big throwers in the league. Really fills, I think, a gaping hole left by the retirement of Bobby Lay. That 1-2 backfield attack of Austin Taylor and Lay was so potent and efficient in both the long ball and setting up the rest of the offense the past couple of years. Connole is about as prototypical of a fill as you could get for Bobby Lay. Little bit undersized, but man, when that backhand's ripping, it's full field green light, right? And Atlanta loves the long ball. They love to test teams deep. They've got ostensibly right now the number 1 deep target in the league in Brett Halsmeyer. He's just unguardable in one-on-one in deep space. So great addition there. Elijah Jaime comes back on as a practice player. This is a guy who scored pretty much 50 goals a season for 3 straight years for the Hustle. So it'll be interesting to see where exactly they fit him back in after a couple of years out in Salt Lake. They also bring back Kenny Taylor, JP Burns, who have been in veteran roles on the D-line in the past. Burns was the team's all-star nomination in 2022. And then a really interesting, I think, project piece in Michael Poe. He was selected as a runner-up for Ultiworld's breakout player of the year last year in the collegiate division in D1. They kind of rate him as a thrower. So again, more options around both Connole and Austin Taylor. Be interesting to see how they develop there. Atlanta in general, I think, is going to be interesting because they have so many clear expectations. They've got this brutal schedule. And so how quickly can they get these new pieces up and running in their respective roles, I think will be really interesting to watch. Just want to kind of run through these little potpourri items of additions, and then I'll kick it back to you, Evan. In Colorado, we've got kind of cash in, cash out. Zach Slayton, Sam Van Duzen, Elliot Hawkins, and Johnny Sickles all on board for the summit in 2025. The latter 2 really interesting young prospects with Team USA experience. Van Duzen, one of the best pullers in league history, coming over from Pittsburgh, one big left-handed thrower. Slayton, great athlete coming out of Austin Seoul, probably figures as a D-line prospect, but also, in addition to those signings, Colorado will be losing a contingent of defensive starters, most notably Matthew Agee, Alex Tatum, and Nick Snuska, who have really been the backbone over the last 3 years, especially after Cody Spicer retired following the 2023 season. Carolina, you've got them bringing back Rutledge Smith, one of the most exciting young prospects in the game. Hasn't really taken foothold in the professional association yet, but with him and the possibility of Ben Dameron joining the Carolina Flyers, I mean, last year's runners-up look to be almost at full strength again after we had so much worry and consternation with them losing Henry Fisher and Anders Jungst, which is understandable. But again, Carolina doesn't, regress. They just reload. And then just kind of finally, with all this other movement and roster stuff, it's probably been noticeable that Salt Lake has been down a few of their starters. They lose Connole and Jaime with these Atlanta signings. Simon Dastrup, who took some offensive starting roles last year, gone to Chicago. Grant Lindsley has not re-signed with the team. Joe Merrill is going to be missing 2025 with an injury. A lot of question marks around the Shred, who have finished with 3 straight 10-win regular seasons. And yet, from kind of the hubbub talking with Ian Toner, who had talked with Bryce Merrill, this is going to be a young, athletic, fast Shred team in 2025. They're not going to be as precisely calibrated. They're going to be a little bit more loose in terms of their turnover numbers, but they are going to be smash and grab in the open field. I really feel like that's an interesting approach for them because it's kind of been where they've been making hay a lot. They're a top 5 team in break scores per game. They're a clear athletic juggernaut in terms of their defensive rotations. They're going to be young. They're going to get out and run. Be interesting to see. So I just threw a whole bunch at you. Where do you kind of want to start?
I'll start with most recently what you were talking about, because you're right. There was a lot of stuff thrown out there, and I feel like there's interesting conversations to be had with each of them. I think the Salt Lake Shred at the end of last year had a little bit of an identity crisis, particularly on offense.
You think?
Well, as you said, their early days were kind of based upon like gunslinger, highlights, athletes, which made for super fan friendly ultimate. But then they would run into an interdivisional matchup against a team that just took a little bit better care of the disc, a little bit more cautious, a little bit more judicious with their decisions. And Salt Lake was all of a sudden struggling. And the electric kind of highlight making flow that we saw from their offense so many times, New York just completely shut them down last year, completely shut them down in the championship game 2 years ago. And look, Bryce Merrill is a smart guy, and he kind of has acknowledged we need to change. Well, now it's kind of sounding like, all right, well, we're going to go back to what we were. So I don't know if they know what they are yet, and that's okay. From my outside perch, and I'm not trying to say I know more than them, it's just my perspective. I think they're going to hand their offense to McKay Jorgensen and Will Selfridge. And hopefully those two guys are healthy, and hopefully those two guys can cook, and Jordan Kerr can fill in, and Jace Dunabile can score goals. Ben Field is another guy that Ian reported is not planning to play this year. And, he had his ups and downs last year, but overall had a pretty solid season for the Shred O-line. So, look, I trust in Bryce and kind of Salt Lake's team culture, which is fun, athletes, committed hard. They practice as much, if not more, than any other team in the league. They take this super seriously, and they have young horses to throw out there. So, and quite frankly, their schedule this year, yes, they have Atlanta, yes, they have Minnesota, but I think they're going to be a playoff team for sure, and I think they're going to be a capable team. I think Salt Lake is a team that will certainly be better this year in July than they are in April, May, which, maybe wasn't the case last year. Salt Lake was a better team in April and May last year than they were in July and August, and that's why they didn't make it a championship weekend.
Injuries. Big part of that was injuries. They got absolutely whacked by the end of the season on both lines, and especially on defense. I mean, they're still kind of dealing with it a little bit. Ian reported on it as well. They're going to be down.
Yeah.
Both Hoffmans are still kind of struggling to get back on the field. I mentioned before, Joe Merrill will be out for the season after sustaining that late, I believe it was an Achilles injury last year. So he'll be gone for the entirety of 2025, going to take it off. Devin Terry, not back on the field. He was a difference maker at times, particularly in single coverage, just able to get blocks.
Yeah, Adam, that's the core. That's the core of their D-line. But
now they get a healthy Tony Munga, who struggled to stay healthy in the back half of last year. And I really thought he had a chance for an all-defensive nomination, how he was playing the first month of the season. I mean, that game at Colorado, he started to take over at times in the second half. He was trading trash talk with Atkins in the second half throughout that game. And I feel like he brings a attitude component that this Salt Lake team sorely needs. Kyle Weinberg, who was an all defensive nomination or selection, in 2023. He was gone the back half of last year. He's terrific in both, I think, coverage as a big body defender as well as in transition. Last year, he was really showing a dimension as a thrower, particularly in their kind of outlet hook game in transition. Like, those returners are really great. And again, it's Salt Lake Ultimate. I think we got to start talking about them kind of being a little bit like Carolina. We're sure there are some concerns around the names lost here. They're also just going to grow a crop of, 20-year-olds who we haven't really talked a whole bunch about, but man, they're going to come out firing. I mean, that's what they did in 2022. We had no idea what the Shred team was going to do. They went into San Diego, the 2-time reigning divisional champs, and ran them off the field. Yeah. Selfridge and the Jorgensens and Merrill just turned it into a track meet. I mean, I feel like Salt Lake can get back to that. I mean, Oscar Brown, terrific young prospect. You talk about Selfridge and McKay Jorgensen. Those dudes click into top gear immediately. It gets them in trouble sometimes, but if everyone's working on that page and they're just blitzing teams.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's why I said I trusted their culture and I think they're going to be there. You brought up the name Alex Atkins. The Colorado Summit are also, as you mentioned, losing a core of really valuable defenders. Kind of the identity of their defense has been built around guys that are gone from the past couple of years. Cody Spicer, Schnushka, as you mentioned, Tatum, Agee. So I think about this Colorado team and, they add Keenan Lawrence. I think he'll slot in on offense. They add Tobias Brooks. I think he'll slot in on offense. I wonder, could this team get away, Colorado, could they get away with shifting Alex Atkins onto D and using his pulls and using his swagger and letting him cook with Sam Van Dusen, and who is also a really underrated pickup for them. Like, he's a really good player. How crazy is it that, like, the Pittsburgh trio of Thomas Edmonds, Sam Van Dusen, and Max Sheppard are now in 3 different places, all, with interesting storylines to them in pursuit of a championship.
And I still like the Thunderbirds in their absence as a project developing. Again, it gets back to that kind of basis on offense that they're building around with Hoffenkamp, Mast, Drehaus is back for them. Like, they're pretty solid. They've been borrowing concepts from DC, and they're just a lot more anchored. You talk about these are fantastic pieces in Van Dusen, Sheppard, and Edmonds, and yet Pittsburgh feels like they're finally starting to get this as opposed to where they've just kind of plateaued the past few years.
We will see. They certainly showed they can beat anybody in their division last year. They also showed they can lose to anybody. How committed they're going to be, how consistent they're going to be, those are questions remain to be seen. What do you think about the idea that popped into my head at the start of this conversation of Colorado making Alex Atkins the foundational piece of their D-line?
It's an idea, and I definitely hear it from the dimension of putting his arm to use as a puller. Now, obviously, if you've got Van Dusen available for a lot of games, I feel like he's going to be the number one option to do that, considering his extensive body of work with the Thunderbirds initiating their defensive pulls. But, Atkins did play a fair amount of defense when Colorado went on their Central Division road trip last year at Madison and at Minnesota. And he did pretty well, particularly in the handler set. He's got enough agility, and his height is so problematic. Okay. If there's any kind of swilly passes, he can just eat it up in the backfield. And then you've got one of the best attackers in the league in transition, ostensibly with numbers. I do like it as a theoretical concept. I just wonder what then becomes the throwing backfield for Colorado, right? Because again, we're past the age of Nethercutt now. We're past that. That's kind of where this team started at elevation, right? Nethercutt bombs up in the Rockies. We're moving on past that. We've got Kins and Feiner kind of in that backfield. But what is that other player that's going to really step up beside them? Tobias Brooks is a fantastic talent, really is starting to develop as a thrower too, in addition to his fantastic skills as a receiver. But I don't know if he's quite there in terms of initiating from the backfield. Maybe he'll come out of this collegiate season and be totally ready for it. That would not surprise me one bit. But I I wonder who that balance complement piece is off of Feiner if you remove Kins, because I think that that's been a real sore spot for the Summit. It's kind of what they continually tinkered with Nethercutt was who's going to be the sort of complementary handler that knows when to get it to their number one quarterback and when to kind of take their own shots. And so Kins and Feiner just have that ready-made, connection and that chemistry. So going away from that, it's just which of these young prospects, right, is going to step up. Colorado has no lacking of talent. I think that they can find somebody. It's just, again, getting them up to speed, making sure it actually gels in a real way, and that you're not just sacrificing, an all UFA player, one of the best talents in the league, over the defense to try a lineup experimentation, right?
So you don't think Rodney Adams, high school quarterback, could be the center handler for the Colorado O-line this year? Is that what you're saying?
Again, as I described, if they figure out a way for him to reliably get 10-yard passes and they just say, hey, you play rabbit and you stay out in front of your defender and just sort of free stuff up off of Feiner taking looks when he wants, that could work. I trust TK and Mike Lund and the rest of this Colorado staff to kind of tinker a bit. That's what they did really well last year. It just took them till the middle of the season to figure out their rotations. And by that point, they were already so far behind in the standings that they were playing catch up. I think this year, they have a little bit more data. And again, we talked about New York sustaining big losses before last year. I don't know that there was a bigger individual player loss than Colorado not having Cody Spicer. Right? He was everything to that team's defense. You could just see it without him last year.
Yeah.
And so I think getting a full page turn on that, being with a new system, I think that will benefit them a lot. So yeah, I know I've completely avoided answering your question about Kins. I think it's an interesting idea. Again, I wonder who fills that role on offense. Is it Kuhlman? Is it Kuhlman?
It's not Kuhlman, and it's a good question, Adam. It really is. I think of a guy like, Jeremy Knopf didn't end up playing at all last year for the Summit. But,
right.
A couple of years ago, he had a 96, 98% completion rate for the DC Breeze, playing mostly offense. Could he be a guy in the backfield? Another guy that I don't know about, and I like to ask questions that I at least have some semblance of an answer to, especially when we're live to public. Have you heard anything about Danny Landisman? Obviously he got hurt in the playoff game 2023 against his dad's team, the Aviators. And, a healthy Danny Landisman before the injury, he could be the answer to your question of who's the main orchestrator.
Would absolutely be he was growing up as the face of the franchise before that derailment of the injury.
So look, the Colorado Summit are just one of the many super interesting teams that have a really high ceiling, but also a lot of question marks. And how this is why coaching and leadership and buy-in is so important in the UFA in 2025, because there is not one team that is so much more talented than the rest. So maximizing your team's ability, and that you're going to deal with adversity through, simple on-field mistakes, but also missing certain guys certain weeks because of whatever injuries that pop up, and just how teams can be adaptable on the fly. And that's coaching and that's leadership. And more than those two things, it's them being on the same page and kind of aligned with each other, so that, leadership, when I say leadership, I mean captains, always trusts in what the coaches are doing and vice versa. And the number of times that that's not the case is alarming around the league. When you hear whispers, we did this, I don't know if it was the right thing, but that's what that is those are the seeds of mistrust, and the ground becomes very very tenuous at that point, with just the team's foundation and their ability to weather a storm. And I think we saw that a little bit, last year with Colorado. Yes, they had
Colorado,
injuries.
Atlanta, Salt Lake,
Well, yeah,
you
but
see
just
these
with
tremors.
Colorado, they had the injuries. They didn't handle it well, and they didn't make the right. They didn't push the right buttons, and they lost a lot of close games at the very, very end. And then they're on the outside looking in, and like that's going to happen to probably multiple teams this year that we're thinking here in March. Oh yeah, this team's definitely going to the playoffs. That's why I mentioned a team like Boston. Like, you know, the, I think Sam Rosenthal did a good job with that team last year. It remains to be seen exactly what their leadership looks like. Certainly, Jeff Babbitt's fingerprints, I would expect to be all over it. But like, Babbitt's been a pretty healthy player, aside from the concussion issue that took him out of a playoff game a couple of years ago. And there's reasons I think to be uncertain about a team like Boston, which is why going back to the DC thing, like I just kind of trust in DC's culture and system and depth and leadership and track record that we haven't seen in Colorado, we haven't seen in Boston.
Yeah, but
The
I feel like last year kind of upset a bit of that, right? Like, I mean, those are the advantages that like Salt Lake held against Seattle. That didn't stop Seattle from just seizing their momentum late in the season and going on that run to make a semifinals appearance. And I think that that's kind of the new landscape of the league. It's building sort of these ramps through your schedule where you get that sense of, okay, we've got some ground beneath us, as opposed to the opposite end where you have like a Colorado who just could not stop losing close games. And then they're just kind of self-defeated, sitting at 4-6. And while they kind of scrapped together to get back to 6-6, it was, difficult. Whereas you have the Seattle team who basically had similar results. They just took care of it a little bit better. And it made all the difference. Like, I don't know that institutional element matters as much when there are just single games deciding whether you advance or not. I mean, these are razor thin margins. I think one of the most interesting things would be to go back after last year and just kind of flip a couple of results and see how we would think about things differently, particularly like in the East Division, or for say that Colorado team. What if we just kind of flip their Central Division games, give them both of those? They're 8-4, they're in the playoffs, do they look differently, trending into that first round playoff game, and maybe knock off Seattle and Seattle, get revenge, after losing in week 10. Like, they lost that week 10 game at Seattle on a layout goal to Tommy Lee in the final 5 seconds of regulation. I mean, the way in which we conceive of these teams is decided by the most razor thin plays. And I just think this year that's all going to become so much more pronounced, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's just going to be so much more of a necessary attention to detail, as you've kind of been beating on this entire episode of, if you're not paying attention to how these players fit and to how these rosters are forming, there's way too much competition for you to just like sit above water, right? Like, there's 8+ teams right now that could very feasibly contend for a title. I mean, we still don't know what's happening in Oakland. We still don't know what's happening in DC. This is a top 4 team last year. They were the favorite to win championship weekend going into the bracket. And yet we still have loose ends. But I think that'll do it for now on this episode of Swing Pass. I feel like we could go into 20 more directions, but we'll put a cap on it for here and now, because, within the next 24 hours, we're going to have the news on DC's roster and where they're starting to sign stuff. And that'll probably set off a new wave of news, right?
I'll tease one thought for a future episode. Special teams in 2025 will decide games. And I don't mean special teams in terms of talent. I mean end of quarters, end of half situations, teams handling those little situations the best. Those will decide games more than ever with how close everything is.
Do we count like red zone opportunities in our sport as like a special teams? I kind of do. I feel like that, especially on offense, fielding pulls right now feels like a special teams kind of function, right? Like you see teams like DC, one of the best at getting up off of that back line quickly and getting into attacking positions. You know, these past 2 years, if you kind of mire around in the end zone for 2 to 3 throws, it's Callahan country. I mean, we saw that most pronouncedly in 2023 when we had a record number 44 Callahans throughout the league or whatever insane number it was. It diminished last year, but teams had to get better at that situational ultimate of, man, we got to work out from our own end zone. Similarly, I feel like punching in red zone opportunities, it's just, if you're not doing it, you're going to lose games. I mean, that's where Colorado struggled last year and why they couldn't close out in tight matches. And so, yeah, I totally concur with you. I feel like special teams could be the X factor. You know, maybe we don't even look at, conversion rates as much. I mean, that's how Minnesota won, right? Like they were not a top offensive team last year, even defensively. Some of their metrics, they're 5 to 10. They're not leading the league. They were just good at that situational ultimate. And we got to end here because you're going to bring in Brady and Belichick in a moment. I can feel it. I can feel it in the ethosphere or whatever. So
you don't want to talk about them now? You want to sign off?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe Tom Brady does know about situational ultimate. We can call him up sometime. But for here and now, that'll do it for this episode of Swing Pass. Evan and I will be back next week to talk about surely more roster movement and news. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll talk soon. Bye now.